A few weeks ago, I had one of the weirdest experiences of my life. I still don't really know how it all went down, but it definitely could have ended much worse. So, I'm at this dive bar with my buddy Mike. Nothing crazy, just a regular night out. We've been friends for a while and like to grab a beer and talk about whatever's been going on. We don't go out too often, but when we do, it's nothing more than the usual. Chill place, decent beer, not too loud, not too crowded. That night was just like any other until these two women walked in. They didn't stand out in any obvious way, and we didn't think much of them when they first sat down at our table. They just started chatting with us, asking what we were drinking and what we did for a living. The conversation was light, and we just went with it. They were fun to talk to. They laughed at our jokes, kept the conversation going, and we found ourselves talking about random things like music and movies, just like we would with anyone else at the bar. Mike was especially enjoying the attention, which didn't surprise me. He's a pretty outgoing guy. They both had glasses in front of them, but they hadn't taken a sip all night. It didn't really bother me at first, though. Maybe they weren't big drinkers, or maybe they were pacing themselves. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. At one point, one of them, let's call her Red Lipstick, got up to go to the bathroom, and I didn't think much of it. When she came back, she handed me a fresh drink and smiled. It was just one of those casual, here you go moments. She said something like, "We've had so much fun talking with you guys. We should keep the night going." Mike, of course, didn't hesitate. He took a huge gulp of his drink. The girl with red lipstick really wanted me to take a drink. "Come on, please. Take a drink for me," she said, placing her hand on my leg. I had a feeling that maybe it was time to be careful, but I wasn't sure why. I grabbed the glass and tipped it way back, blocking the liquid with my tongue. I set the glass down and swallowed my saliva. I didn't need any more to drink. I'd already had plenty. Plus, if these Red Lipstick really wanted to have a good time, I figured it would be a better experience for us both if I didn't have any more. A few minutes later, the women suggested we leave and head to their place. Mike was all in, practically dragging me out the door. I was both excited and nervous. I was definitely interested, but still had an extreme sense of caution about me. When we stepped outside, I was still trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I looked at Mike, and he was definitely more drunk than I expected. I kept a hold of him, trying to keep him steady. Eventually I gave up and stepped away from him. The other woman, who had been talking to Mike all night, lit a cigarette. "You guys mind if we just hang out here for a bit?" she asked. Then a van pulled up. It was a plain black van with no markings. Two men stepped out and started walking toward us. They were both very muscular and intimidating. I didn't know what to make of it at first. It felt like a weird coincidence, but there was something about the way they moved, like they were expecting us. I looked over and saw Mike on the ground, completely passed out. The women didn't seem concerned at all. One of the men walked over to Mike and grabbed him. They started dragging him toward the van. "This one should be out any second now," Red Lipstick said to the men, referring to me obviously. And that's when I realized I had to do something fast. At this point, it was clear what was going on. I turned around and ran back into the bar. I wasn't sure what I was going to say, but I knew I had to get help. I told the bartender to call the cops. Something wasn't right out there. When I went back outside, the van was gone. The women were gone. Mike was still lying there on the sidewalk, passed out, but safe. I don't even know how long I'd been inside talking to the bartender, but when I came back, everything had changed. The cops came, but by then, the trail had gone cold. No sign of the van, no sign of the women. They checked Mike over, but he was fine. He didn't remember anything after we stepped outside. The whole thing felt like some kind of weird dream, but it was real. To this day, I don't know who those people were or what they wanted, but I'm just glad I didn't end up in their van. I ended up getting pretty lucky that night, but not in the way I had expected. If you're enjoying the video so far, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Any support would be greatly appreciated. This happened about 10 years ago, and I still think about it all the time. I was 22, broke, and moving across the country for a new job. I had packed everything I owned into my crappy old sedan and was driving from Colorado to Oregon. I was doing the trip in 2 days, planning to stop at a motel somewhere in Idaho. I didn't book ahead, figured I'd just find a place when I got tired. That was my first mistake. Around 11 p.m., I was somewhere in rural Idaho, driving down a stretch of highway with nothing but fields and trees on either side. My gas tank was getting low, so I pulled into a tiny roadside gas station, the kind with a single pump and a store that looked abandoned. I got out and tried the pump. It was one of those older ones where you had to pay inside first. I stepped into the store. The bell over the door jingled, and I immediately felt weird. It wasn't empty. There was a guy behind the counter, mid-50s, greasy-looking, wearing a stained tank top. He was watching an old TV set behind the counter, not even looking at me. I told him I needed to fill up, and he barely reacted. Just grunted, rang me up, and told me the pump was good to go. I went back outside, started pumping gas, and that's when I noticed the truck. Old, rusted out, parked at the far end of the lot, engine idling. The headlights were off, but I could see 2 people sitting inside. They weren't getting gas. They weren't going inside. They were watching me. I finished pumping as fast as I could, got in my car, and pulled out onto the highway. I tried to shake it off, probably just some locals hanging out. No big deal. Then I checked my mirror. The truck pulled out right after me. I told myself it was a coincidence. There were only so many roads out here. Maybe they were just headed the same way. Then they got closer. Not tailgating, but close enough that I knew it wasn't normal. I sped up. So did they. I changed lanes. So did they. That's when I knew they were following me. I was in the middle of nowhere, with no idea how long until the next town. I didn't want to pull over, not out here. Then I saw a sign. Rest stop. 2 miles. It wasn't much, but rest stops usually had lights. Maybe even other people. I took the exit. The rest stop was small, just a few vending machines, a couple of bathrooms, and a handful of parked cars. But it was lit. That was enough for me. I pulled in and parked near a car with its lights on, hoping someone was inside. The truck kept driving, blowing past the rest stop. I let out a breath. Maybe they weren't following me after all. I stayed parked for a while, trying to calm down. After about 10 minutes, I decided I was probably safe. I got back on the highway. I didn't see the truck. I drove for another hour, wide awake now, gripping the wheel. The next town was still a ways off, but I saw a sign for a motel and decided to stop for the night. It was a dive, one of those motels where you have to check in through a bulletproof window. But at that point, I didn't care. I just wanted to sleep. The guy at the counter gave me a key, and I walked to my room. I was so close to safety. Then, as I was unlocking my door, I heard it, the rumble of a truck engine. I turned around. At the far end of the parking lot, half hidden in the dark, was the same rusted truck. They had waited for me. My stomach dropped. I didn't even go into my room. I just turned around and walked straight back to the front desk. I told the guy behind the counter that some men had followed me from the highway, and I didn't feel safe. He actually seemed concerned, told me to hang tight and he'd go take a look. He stepped outside, looked around for a while, then came back and said the truck was gone. Maybe they had just pulled over for a bit. I wasn't convinced, but at that point, I didn't know what else to do. I went to my room, locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle, and barely slept. By morning, the truck was nowhere in sight. I got in my car and drove straight to Oregon, not stopping for anything. To this day, I don't know what they wanted. Maybe they were just messing with me. Maybe they planned on waiting until I fell asleep in my car at the rest stop. Maybe they thought I was an easy target. All I know is that if I hadn't stopped at that rest stop, I don't think I would have made it through the night. A few years back, I inherited a small cabin from my uncle. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-room place deep in the woods of Montana. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove and an old well out back. He'd used it as a hunting cabin, but after he passed, it just kind of sat there. One fall, I decided to spend a weekend up there. I had some time off work, and I figured I'd use the chance to disconnect for a bit. I packed up my truck with supplies, food, firewood, a rifle, and a few other essentials, then drove out early on a Friday morning. The cabin was about an hour from the nearest town, down a long dirt road that barely looked like it had been used in years. When I pulled up, it looked exactly how I remembered it. Weathered wood, a sagging porch, and a roof that probably needed work. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air felt stale, like it hadn't been opened in a long time. The chairs weren't in the right spots. My uncle's old lantern, which usually sat on the fireplace mantel, was on the floor near the door. And the biggest thing, the door to the old storage closet was slightly open. I figured maybe animals had gotten in at some point. The place wasn't exactly secure. I spent the day chopping firewood, walking the property, just enjoying being out in the woods. By the time night rolled around, I had a fire going in the wood stove and was settling in with a book and a drink. That's when I heard it. A soft thump outside. Not an animal rustling through leaves. Not a tree branch creaking in the wind. I froze, listening. A few seconds passed. Then another sound. A slow, dragging noise like something heavy being pulled across the dirt. I grabbed my rifle, turned off the lantern, and moved toward the window as quietly as I could. The moon was out, casting just enough light for me to see the clearing outside. And that's when I saw footprints, fresh ones, a set of them, leading from the trees toward the cabin. I hadn't seen them earlier, because they weren't there earlier. I locked the door and sat in the dark. For what felt like hours, there was nothing. No footsteps. No more dragging sounds. Just silence. Then, sometime in the dead of night, I heard it. Not outside. Inside. A quiet, slow creak from the floorboards, coming from the closet. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, the sound of a foot stepping forward. I lunged for the lantern, flicked it on, and swung my rifle toward the closet just as the door swung open. And there was someone standing inside. A man, filthy, barefoot, clothes in tatters, eyes wide and sunken like he hadn't seen daylight in weeks. I don't remember pulling the trigger. The shot just happened. But he bolted, sprinting out of the cabin like a wild animal. I didn't chase him. I didn't sleep. I sat there, gun in my lap, waiting for sunrise. The next morning, I found the closet floor had been torn open. Beneath it was a small hole just big enough for someone to crawl into. A hole that hadn't been there when my uncle was alive. I packed my things and got the hell out. I never went back. I sold the land a few months later, cheap, to some guy from out of state. I never told him what happened. This happened a couple of years ago, and I still can't shake how close I came to something really bad happening. For context, I work late shifts at a restaurant, usually closing around 2 or 3 a.m. I don't mind it. The drive home is peaceful, no traffic, just quiet roads. At the time, I lived in a smaller town, and my drive home took me down a mix of highways and back roads. One night, after a particularly rough shift, I clocked out at around 2:30 a.m. and walked to my car in the near-empty parking lot. It was raining lightly, and I remember pulling my hoodie up, digging my keys out, and unlocking my car. I got in, started the engine, and headed home. About 5 minutes into the drive, I had this weird feeling. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The roads were empty, the rain was light but steady, and I was the only car in sight. But the whole time, I felt wrong, like I wasn't alone. I glanced in my rearview mirror. Just the back seat. Nothing there. I shook it off, chalking it up to being tired. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Then I noticed something. My rearview mirror was tilted slightly too high. Not a lot, just enough that I had to adjust it to see the road behind me properly. I knew for a fact I hadn't moved it when I got in. That's when the feeling of being watched hit me hard. I turned around, really looking this time, and that's when I saw it. A shape, low on the floor, behind my passenger's seat. I slammed the brakes so hard, my tires skidded. My heart was pounding. The shape wasn't moving. For a second, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe it was my backpack or a jacket, something I'd forgotten about. But then, in the dim glow of the dashboard lights, I saw a hand move. Someone was in my back seat, hiding. I don't even remember getting out, but the next thing I knew, I was standing in the middle of the road, rain pouring down, my car still running. I did not want to open that door. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring, heart racing. The road was empty, no cars, no houses nearby, just a long stretch of wet pavement. Then, the back door creaked open. A man stepped out, tall, thin, filthy. His clothes were ragged, soaked from the rain, and he wasn't wearing any shoes. He moved slowly, like he didn't expect to be seen, like he was trying to figure out his next move. We just stood there, staring at each other. Then he grinned. A slow, wide, unnatural grin. And he took a step toward me. I don't think I've ever moved faster in my life. I bolted around the car, jumped in the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut just as he lunged forward. I floored it. I didn't stop until I was a few miles down the road, parked under the lights of a gas station. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely pull out my phone to call the cops. They showed up pretty fast, but the guy was long gone by then. They checked my car, nothing missing, no signs of forced entry. The officer asked if I was sure I'd locked my doors before leaving work. I was sure. He must have gotten in while I was at work. My car was parked in the restaurant lot for hours. He could have been in there the entire time, waiting for me. I don't know what his plan was. I don't want to know. But ever since that night, I always check my back seat before getting in my car. This happened to me and my friend Mark back in 2017. We were doing a cross-country road trip, sleeping in the car most nights, but occasionally camping if we found a decent spot. One night, we pulled into a small campground in Idaho, way out in the woods, pretty far from any towns. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing we found on a camping app. The place was completely empty when we got there. No other cars, no other campers, just us. We set up our tent, made a fire, and had a few beers before calling it a night. It was completely silent out there, aside from the usual sounds of the woods. At around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to pee. The fire had burned down to embers, and the moon was bright enough that I didn't need a flashlight. I stepped out of the tent, walked a little ways into the trees, and did my business. As I was heading back, I noticed something. There was a guy standing at the edge of our campsite, just outside the glow of the dying fire. I froze, heart pounding. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at our tent. He wasn't dressed like a hiker or a camper. No backpack, no gear, just jeans and a dark hoodie. I stood there for what felt like forever, debating whether I should say something. My first thought was that maybe he needed help, maybe he was lost. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized he wasn't acting like someone who needed help. He wasn't looking around, wasn't calling out, just staring at the tent. Eventually, I took a step forward and said, "Hey man, you okay?" No reaction. Then he turned and walked back into the woods. Not in a hurry, not startled, just casually disappeared into the trees. At that point, I was officially freaked out. I woke up Mark, told him what I saw, and we both sat there for a while, listening. Nothing, just silence. We debated packing up and leaving, but we were hours from the nearest town, and driving through unfamiliar mountain roads in the middle of the night didn't seem any safer than just staying put. So we stayed up in shifts, one of us keeping watch while the other dozed off. At some point, I fell asleep. When we woke up at sunrise, we immediately started packing up. The whole thing felt stupid in the daylight, like maybe it was just some random guy who was passing through. As we looked around, we noticed footprints all around our tent. The fire had burned out completely overnight, so the ground was covered in a thin layer of frost. And in that frost, we could clearly see dozens of footprints. Not just near where I saw him, not just a few steps into the woods. They circled our tent, over and over. We got out of there fast.